Diamond Comics files for bankruptcy. Sad. Just sad. Well, there goes the comic book industry. Coming to paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, A Thorn in My Side. The man who rules the world takes on an agent from the CIA from the Black Boule in this action-packed all-new John Haynes series adventure. Pre-order your copy of John Haynes' A Thorn in My Side at Amazon.com and other online booksellers. Better get the coleslaw, y'all, cause we're having us a barbecue. Diamond Comics Distributors is declaring Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Now, Diamond Comics Distributors was the sole distributor of comic books in the United States and other parts of North America until many comic book publishers decided to go to Penguin Random House. And after many major comic book publishers like Marvel, DC, Image, and Boom Comics decided to take their publications and have them distributed at Penguin Random House, this is where Diamond Comics Distributors lost its monopoly and complete control over the entire comic book industry. And without product to distribute, Diamond Comics Distributors basically is in a place where it has to declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy to cover all of its issues as related to its debts, and they're basically hoping to be sold to another company. Now, this whole situation with Diamond Comics Distributors basically shows me how much worse things are getting in the overall comic book industry, which has been in a major state of decline since the mid-1990s. Now, back in the mid-1990s, we were at the tail end of what was considered to be a speculator boom, and the speculator boom was a time when people were going out and buying lots of new comics, speculating on these books rising in value as related to the stories in the comics. However, what happened in the aftermath of this speculator boom, which was brought on by several different events, such as Marvel Comics basically changing its whole approach to editorial, where they changed their editorial from having one leader at the top, such as Jim Shooter, who was in charge for Marvel Comics from 1978 to 1987, and they had Tom DeFalco in charge for a time, but then decided to have different characters under different editorial staff, and that wound up messing up Marvel, along with a decision to buy Heroes World and get into distribution. And it was that decision of Marvel, as they incorporated to buy Heroes World to start distributing its own comics, that basically created a domino effect in the overall comic book industry, taking it away from the traditional retail markets to winding up heavily focusing on the direct market. And as many comic book companies decided to walk away from the traditional publishing market and go to the direct market, they decided to go out here and focus on only the direct market. And this is where Diamond Comics Distributors eventually wound up having a monopoly over the entire comic book industry as related to distribution, due to the complete implosion of the comic book industry in the mid-1990s, partially due to really terrible storytelling during the tail end of the speculator boom and the extreme comic book style of storytelling, and the overall issues that were changing from distribution from the traditional market to looking to switch over to the direct market, because many distributors really they went out of business because the big problem with the direct market for them was they had to deal with the issue of returnability, and the issue of returnability basically alienated a lot of retailers like the grocery stores, the bodegas, the supermarkets, and the drugstores, who want to get returnability. And without that returnability, many of those retailers basically balked at looking to stock comic books on their shelves, because the way these businesses run are on a razor-thin profit margin. And with them running on a razor-thin profit margin, they need to be able to return any sort of material that doesn't sell within a month or is damaged for store credit, and without them being able to get that returnability, many retailers didn't want anything to do with comics outside of comic book stores. Now, many of the comic book stores basically loved the entire direct market because they could go out here and order lots of comics, and as they ordered lots of comics, they had to keep those comics because they could not be returned. But this was a covert contract that many retailers made who ran comic book stores, because those comics that they did not get returned, those unsold copies, they could speculate on the value of those unsold copies and sell them as back issues later on. That was what meant that kept many comic shops in business for the time after about 1995 or so, up until about now. And basically, this was a good deal for many comic book store owners until editorial changed over at Marvel and DC, and changed for the worse with the hiring of Joe Quesada at Marvel in 2001 and the hiring of Dan Didio in 2002. And sadly, the hiring of both of these individuals who had no publishing experience. This basically started the death spiral for the overall comic book industry, because as both of these editors came in charge, they started creating a lot more darker stories, and these darker stories started alienating many of the longtime comic book customers. And as it alienated many of the longtime comic book customers, a lot of the foot traffic that came to the comic stores to pick up comics started to decline. And as the sales started to decline, this is where the comic book industry started to go into really a death spiral as related to things that was made progressively worse, first in 2011 by Dan Didio, ending the classic DC universe and replacing it with the new 52 after Flashpoint. And this was further exacerbated when new Marvel Comics editor Axel Alonso introduced the all-new, all-different Marvel. And these events basically wound up creating escalating and the death spiral of the entire comic book industry as more customers were alienated. And this is where comic shops really started to feel the impact, because when people stopped coming to the comic book store, what happened was many of these books remained unsold. And as these books remained unsold, what happened is many of the comic shop owners could not rely on these unsold copies to be able to speculate on as related to their value as back issues. And as they could not go out here and be able to speculate on their value as back issues, they basically wound up with their profit margin that was already razor thin at retail becoming progressively worse. And this is where we went from 9,000 comic book stores to 3,000 comic book stores in 2018. And now in 2025, we are at a point where there are only 300 comic book stores, because many of the comic shop owners have been just taking huge losses because much of the content being produced at these comic book companies is of such poor quality that it doesn't drive any foot traffic to the comic book stores or incentivize the customer to be able to become interested enough to care about the product. And this is where Diamond Comics, what was considered to be a monopoly as related to the comic book industry, found out that their monopoly really had no value. And it had no value because many of the publishers were publishing material that the audience just wasn't interested in reading. Many of these comics basically were unsellable, and they were basically piling up ever since about 2001 or 2002, and the value of these comics is at a level where they're just completely worthless, because most people just don't care about comics anymore. And because they don't care about comics anymore, there's no way to distribute comics to the customer because the customer just isn't interested in buying them. Now, many of the comic book publishers basically want to call themselves shifting gears. They shifted gears because they thought that because Diamond had a monopoly, this was hurting their business, and now they're deciding to switch over to Penguin Random House, and possibly offer up these books again. But if it's still in the direct market, it's not going to change anything. If anything, it's just the definition of insanity, doing the exact same thing and expecting a different result, because it doesn't matter how comics are distributed. The problems are that, one, the books have content that do not engage the reader. Two, the entire books are still under possibly a direct market, so there's still no returnability. And again, if you don't have returnability at retail, your product is not going to be one that retailers have an incentive to go out here and stock on their shelves. They're not going to have an incentive to stock a product on their shelves without returnability. And this is what many people in the comic book industry don't understand, because many of these people in and of themselves do not have any publishing experience like I do. Now, as someone who has publishing experience for over 15 years, running my own imprint, and 20 years as learning the publishing business, and has been writing over 80 books, I can tell you that if you do not have returnability, nobody's going to want to stock your books at any store outside of comic stores. And without anybody there to want to stock your books, you're not going to have that infrastructure to get your product in front of the customer. And that has been the problem that Diamond Comics has been dealing with as related to the products that publishers have been sending them. A lot of problems are that they again don't have that returnability to get into those venues, and if this isn't changing at Penguin Random House, it's still going to be just a bad place for comics. And again, while this did damage to Diamond when they lost all the publishers, it's not going to change the overall state of the industry. No, not going to change the state of the industry in any way, shape, or form. The industry is still in a state of decline, and the bankruptcy of Diamond Comics basically shows us that this industry is definitely in its last days. The comic book industry in and of itself is in its last days. It's basically done at this point, and it's done at this point because you've lost a major distributor, and without that distributor, you lost a piece of the economic infrastructure that allows comic books to be sold. So if you don't have a distributor to go out here and sell, to bring the comics to the shops, you have a problem. And even worse, what you have is that you don't have really that many shops in the country as related to your infrastructure, because right now we only have about 300 comic book stores in the entire United States from almost 10,000 in the 1990s. I mean, when you look at America, where we have over 330 million people and in the entire country, and you have only 300 stores in the entire country, that's not enough infrastructure to serve those customers. No, that's not enough infrastructure to serve all those customers. And Diamond basically wasn't going to be able to make much money just serving only 300 stores. No, if the distributor basically doesn't have product to sell to the stores, then the stores have no product to put on their shelves. And with there being very few stores to put products on the shelf for, this whole industry's infrastructure is at a point where it's basically done at this point. I mean, when you connect the dots as related to things, it doesn't matter if it's Penguin Random House or Diamond. There just isn't an infrastructure for the comic book industry at this point. And this, again, Diamond declaring bankruptcy is basically another nail in the coffin for this dying business. It's another nail in the coffin for the dying business of the comic book industry. And as a longtime comic fan, it deeply saddens me to see this, but I saw this coming many years ago. I mean, I remember back about 2018, 2019, when I was trying to get the ISIS graphic novel crowdfunded. I had talked about how the traditional business model for comics was going to implode, and eventually what was going to happen with comic books is that they were going to have to go down the road of traditional print-on-demand self-publishing, because with print-on-demand, we basically have the technology to basically print these comics as the customer orders them and print them as they are, as people are paying for them. So that's the only way to keep comics going, because the audience just isn't big enough at this point. And I think there are a couple of comic publishers like AC Comics who do the Femforce. They do print on demand like that. But this is the future of comics. I told people this almost about 7 years ago, that the entire business model was not sustainable at this point. I told people that it wasn't sustainable as related to traditional trade publishing, because the readership just isn't there anymore. I mean, when you see A-list characters like Batman and Spider-Man barely selling 10,000 copies or even 5,000 copies at this point, because Spider-Man, the writing is so bad on Spider-Man. Again, this was a character who sold almost 1 million copies, and sold 1 million copies when Todd McFarlane did Spider-Man #1, and Batman was selling again in the high 6 figures, close to 1 million copies every month during Batmania. But now both of these books are basically stagnating due to bad creative, and this bad creative has been a problem for the last 30 years, as we've gotten a culture of bad editorial that encouraged and enabled bad storytelling, and that bad storytelling basically had a trickle-down effect, compounded with Marvel's purchase of Heroes World, which basically led to the derailing of the entire distribution model, because originally, again, comics before Marvel bought Heroes World were sold in grocery stores, were sold in drugstores, were sold in supermarkets, were sold in places that regular people went. But after that, we started to see Diamond, after all the distributors went out of business because they could not get that returnability. We saw a heavy focus on the direct market. I know I'm repeating, but I want you to understand the impact of leaving retail, because returnability is key to any sort of business as related to product. This is what I learned going out and learning about the publishing business. Returnability is important because retailers need to know that they can return product for store credit for a new product, and if they can't get that return, they don't want to stock you on their shelves. They don't want to stock you on their shelves because they get stuck with shrink, and again, the shrink can't be sold, and the whole thing is they have to eat that cost. So the only people who wanted that to have that non-returnable book would be a comic shop, but even they can't afford to keep taking on losses at this point. That's why so many comic shops wound up closing over the last 5 to 10 years. So many shops wound up closing because they just kept taking losses back in 2011 with the New 52, and even before that with Dan Didio's storylines like Identity Crisis and storylines like Civil War that alienated comic book readers. And as we entered into the era of the all-new, all-different Marvel and DC's rebirth and the convergence, basically people were not buying comics anymore, and the books were piling up at the stores to the point where I was watching one YouTuber, he talked about it. He said many of the comics people were buying from the 2000s to now are absolutely worthless, and that's shown by all the comics that are currently at Dollar Tree. All the comics at Dollar Tree are just remainders that are bagged up and sold at a discount. They are not brand new books. So there are a lot of folks out there thinking, oh, these books over at Dollar Tree, that's going to be a bright spot for the comic book industry. No, if you are a publishing professional, you know that a remainder means that this was an unsold book and that the company sold it at a loss in order to basically just get a little bit of money off of this book, because these books are being sold for $1.25 and they were $3 at a comic book store. And this basically shows me how the comic book industry basically is in a further state of freefall and about to basically go completely out of business as a business, because when you have a major distributor going out declaring bankruptcy and another one and many publishers going to another thinking that this is going to be a safe haven. No, it's not a safe haven, because many of these people don't understand publishing. They don't understand that you have to have demand for the books that you supply. You have to have people anticipating those books. Moreover, you need a venue to sell these books. And when it comes to books these days, again, people aren't buying comics, but they are buying manga. And when it comes to manga, you get new product, and the new product is sold at places that people go, like the Korean stores, the Asian stores, and which have groceries and stuff like that. And they're also sold at Barnes & Noble, and they're sold at Amazon, and they're also sold on digital devices. So this whole situation with Diamond is showing us how dire things are with the comic book industry, shows us how dire things are, and how this industry has basically at a place where it's basically at the near of the end, because when you have a distributor declaring bankruptcy, that means that the comic book business is just that much closer to going out of business. Now, if you want to check out my first full comic that's on a print-on-demand platform, John Haynes at Death's Door, you can pick up a copy of that comic on Lulu.com for the same price as it was on the 2022 Kickstarter. And if you want to check out my first, full digital comic, Esteem No Good Deed, you can find that comic on Kindle for 99 cents on Amazon.com. And you can also find it in the book Esteem Blast from the Past, which is available on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find it at other online booksellers like Draft to Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and you can also find it at many of the other books in the SJS Direct universe, like those in the ISIS series, those in the Steam series, those in the John Haynes series, and the Spinsterella trilogy, and many other SJS Direct books. You can find them all on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format, and you can also find them at other online booksellers like Draft to Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. And if you want to see me do more videos taking the comic book industry to the barbecue, you can drop a donation to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available on Lulu, John Haynes at Death's Door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes comic book. Get your copy of the first John Haynes comic at Lulu.com today. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Esteem Horror in the Hamptons. The aspiring angel tries to escape a house of horrors in this action-packed, all-new Esteem series adventure. Get your copy of Esteem Horror in the Hamptons in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.